Good morning, church. About to cross the threshold of Luke 22 into Luke 23 this morning, so we're still making progress, slowly but surely. Last week, as we were looking at Peter's denial of Christ, we got a glimpse, kind of a precursor into the trials that Jesus Christ himself was being put through. The trials of Jesus kind of happened in 6 different phases. The first 3 trials were conducted by the religious elite, conducted by the Sanhedrin, if you will. But because Jews were under Roman oppression, the Jews, the religious leaders, the religious law keepers of that day, did not have the authority to put anybody to death. The Roman government had taken away that privilege. They no longer held that power. And so after the religious leaders come to their conclusion on Jesus' verdict of being guilty, they had to then send Jesus off to the Roman government, and he was put on trial by Pilate, and then Herod, and then Pilate again, as we'll see. But we're going to look at the first 3 trials this morning. However, in the Gospel of Luke, he kind of distills all 3 of these trials down to one little tiny paragraph. And so in order for us to get the full picture of what is going on during these first 3 trials, we're going to be jumping around between the different Gospels again this morning. So get your fingers limber, crack your knuckles, and get ready to turn some pages this morning. But before we dive into the actual text, I want to lay a foundation for you, because I need you to understand that the Jewish people, the Israelite nation, took justice very, very seriously. Finding justice and putting any individual on trial to determine what is just, what is right in any given circumstance, in any given trial, was taken very, very seriously. They took it very, very seriously because God takes justice very, very seriously. You don't have to turn with me, but in Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 18, this is what God says to the Israelite nation. This is Deuteronomy 16, verse 18. God tells his people, he says, "You shall appoint judges and officers in all your towns that the Lord your God is giving you. According to your tribes, they shall judge the people with righteous judgment. You shall not pervert justice." Listen to this. This is verse 19. "You shall not pervert justice, and you shall not show partiality." Man, if only our court system today, which is pushing this social justice where certain people are shown partiality and other people aren't, and it all depends on your race or your ethnicity. But God says, my people, my court system, it's not going to happen like that. You're not going to participate in social justice. You are seeking out true, righteous justice. The rest of verse 19 says, "You shall not show partiality, and you shall not accept a bribe. For a bribe blinds the eye of the wise and subverts the cause of the righteous." Verse 20 says, "Justice, and only justice, you shall follow, that you may live and inherit the land that the Lord your God is giving to you." Justice, and only justice, you shall follow. Justice is important to God. So therefore, justice was and should continue to be important to God's people. And as a matter of fact, by the time you get to the time where Jesus Christ is living, any town, any village that had over 120 men, and these had to be men that were heads of households, men who were married and had started a family, any village, any town that had 120 men also had a court, a local court known as the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin in a local court would be made up of 23 men in this local court. You also had something that is much like the United States Supreme Court. You get to Jerusalem, the capital of Israel, and you had the great Sanhedrin of Jerusalem. It was made up of 70 men, had a total of 70 men, and these 70 men come from three different sects. Came from the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes. Okay, so because justice was important, they had an extensive court system all across the land. Not only did they have an extensive court system, but they also had extensive rules and regulations in how these trials were to be conducted, how these procedures were to be taken underway. And we know that by what we find in the Mishnah today. We find extensive rules that I will be referring to as we go through the trials of Jesus. But just so you understand how important justice was to the Jewish people, justice was important. They didn't want to come into any situation where there was a kangaroo court or where there was just this trumped up trial with trumped up charges. They did everything in their power to try to prevent something like that taking place in their court system because they wanted to find righteous justice. Now, with that in your mind, let's go ahead and look at the trials of Jesus. And I want to start off in the book of John this morning. Turn open to the book of John, chapter 18. John, chapter 18. John chapter 18 and verse 12, and this is after Jesus is arrested, and he's taken to the house of the high priest. John 18, verse 12, and so the band of soldiers and their captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. First, they led him to Annas, and we discussed this a little bit last week. Annas is no longer the high priest, but he was the high priest. He was the high priest originally. In the Old Testament, when you became the high priest, you were the high priest for life. However, if the high priest, living under Roman captivity, engaged in conflict with the Romans said, you can't be high priest. And that's kind of what happened to Annas. So Annas had to step down. He no longer carries the official title of high priest, but he's still calling the shots. He's still pulling the strings. He's still collecting the money that is produced from the temple. Remember, the temple area where they sold the animals and exchanged the money was called the Bazaar of Annas. That's why. Because he's in control. He's kind of like, his family's kind of like the mafia family. He has 5 sons that serve as high priests, and currently, while Jesus is being tried, his son-in-law, Caiaphas, is the official high priest, but Annas is still calling the shots. So first they led him to Annas, and he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. It was Caiaphas who had advised the Jews that it would be expedient that one man should die for the people. So right off the bat, church, we have some serious legal issues just based upon how this first proceeding, this first trial is being taken place. Because in the Mishnah, in the book of Sanhedrin, which is their law book, in chapter 11 and section 2, all trials were to be held in the judgment hall. The official judgment hall of the great court, the great Sanhedrin of Jerusalem, was the temple. Is Jesus taken to the temple? No. He's taken to the high priest's chambers, the high priest's compound, the high priest's home. So right off the bat, we have a problem legally. In the Sanhedrin chapter 4 and section 1, trials could not occur during the night hours. They could not occur during the night hours. You had to wait until after the morning sacrifice before you could put any individual on trial. Yes, could not happen at night hours, and trials could not be held on the eve of the Sabbath or on the eve of a festival. And we know, based upon what we've been studying through Luke, this is the eve of a festival. This is the eve of Passover. And that's why these religious leaders want to hurry up and ram this trial through and seal the deal, because they want to go home and they want to eat the Passover with their family. Also in the Sanhedrin, chapter 1 and part 6, all trials had to be public. Secret trials were forbidden. This trial is happening at night. It's happening on the eve of a festival. And it's happening in secret. Not a lot of people know about this other than the entourage that came to arrest Jesus. John 18, verse 19. The high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Okay, the high priest Annas begins to question Jesus. That's another wrong move. Because if Jesus had been given a defense attorney, which he should have been legally, even by their law, the defense attorney should have been speaking in defense of Jesus first, not the other way around, not Annas asking Jesus about his disciples or about his teaching. In the Sanhedrin Chapter 4, verse 1, capital cases had to follow a strict order beginning with arguments by the defense, meaning Jesus or somebody representing Jesus should have been the first one speaking, not Annas asking Jesus about his disciples or about his teaching. Someone had to speak on Jesus' behalf. In the Sanhedrin 4:1 also, all Sanhedrin judges could argue for acquittal, meaning could argue for Jesus' innocence, to drop the charges, but the judges were not permitted to argue against the defense or argue for a conviction. And yet here is Annas fishing for something, some way to accuse Jesus and put him to death. Was completely wrong. A man who done a very in-depth study by the name of Darrell Block, he says actually the high priest was not even allowed, was not permitted to participate in the questioning of somebody who was convicted of a crime. And yet here is Annas, who is the high priest, or the former high priest, and he is beginning the questioning. In Sanhedrin chapter 3, sections 3 and 4, an accused person could not testify against himself. Jesus could not legally testify against himself, and yet Annas kicks this whole thing off by asking Jesus, kind of poking and prodding, fishing for something, getting Jesus to say something that would convict himself. All kinds of law breaking going on here. Look at verse 20, John chapter 18, verse 20. Jesus answered him, I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in the synagogues and in the temple where all the Jews come together. And I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said. They know what I said. Verse 22, and when he had said these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand, saying, Is that how you answer the high priest? And Jesus answered him, If I have said something wrong, bear witness about it. But if what I have said is right, why do you strike me? And Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Jesus responds to Annas' questions, trying to back Jesus in a corner, trying to trap Jesus in his own words. And he says, listen, I've spoke openly. Nothing I've said has been said in secret. And then he points out, I don't think Jesus is being snarky with Annas. I think Jesus' response here is simply pointing out there's supposed to be witnesses. Witnesses in my defense. Go and ask them, Annas. Perform this trial, conduct this trial the way it's supposed to be. There's no witnesses here on my behalf. Ask them what I said. And one of the guards standing there looking to get brownie points with Annas the high priest, he waylays Jesus in the face. And that's when Annas sends Jesus bound to Caiaphas. Now listen, also in the Sanhedrin 4 and section 1, capital cases were required. When you're putting somebody on trial to put them to death, it's a capital case. And in order to do that, under their own law, required 23 judges to be present. You didn't have that, as Annas is arguing. And I imagine that the reason Annas is questioning Jesus first is to give Caiaphas time to scramble his servants and go gather at least 23 judges to come in and put Jesus on trial. Because after Annas is done questioning him, Annas doesn't get anywhere. Annas then sends him to Caiaphas, who by this time has had time to gather a council. Go with me to Mark chapter 14. Mark chapter 14. Mark chapter 14, and look at verse 55. Mark 14, 55. Now the chief priests and the whole council, so by this time the whole council has come in. Annas is getting ready to put Jesus on his first round of trial. Now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking testimony against Jesus to put him to death. Do you see? Their stated goal is right there. Their goal is to kill Jesus, to put him to death. But they found none. They were seeking testimony, but they found none. Verse 56, for many bore false witness against him, but their testimony did not agree. And some stood up and bore false witness against him, saying, we heard him say, I will destroy the temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made with hands. Yet, even about this, their testimony did not agree. So I stated before, you could not convict a person based upon their own testimony. Therefore, finding witnesses to give testimony against them was key and very important. Listen to what God instructs his people regarding witnesses in Deuteronomy 19. Deuteronomy 19, verse 15. God says, a single witness shall not suffice against a person for any crime or for any wrong in connection with any offense that he has committed. Only in evidence of 2 witnesses or 3 witnesses shall a charge be established. For any crime, God says, I want my people to have 2 or 3 reputable witnesses. That's why when you bring a charge against an elder, even in modern day times in the New Testament, God says if you bring a charge against an elder, that is a serious thing. You need to have 2 or 3 witnesses, credible witnesses to come. Verse 16, if a malice witness arises to accuse a person of wrongdoing, then both parties to the dispute shall appear before the Lord, before the priests and the judges who are in office in those days. Listen to verse 18. The judges shall inquire diligently, and if the witness is a false witness, and has accused his brother falsely, then you shall do to him what he had meant to do to his brother. So you shall purge the evil from your midst. God says if you got a false witness that comes forward and he testifies against his brother, and the punishment, if his brother is found guilty, is death, then you put that false witness to death. That's how important it was to bear true witness. Because if you came against Jesus supposedly under the law, and you bore false witness against Jesus, knowing that if your false witness led to him being crucified, you would be crucified. You had to find true witnesses. That's why verse 18 says, the judges shall inquire diligently. Diligently. In the Sanhedrin, chapter 4, verse 1, or section 1, witnesses for the prosecution were to be examined and cross-examined extensively. This is their own law. This isn't just something I'm coming up with. Sanhedrin chapter 3 and 6 says, each witness in a capital case had to be examined individually and not in the presence of other witnesses. You had to pull this person off to the side and examine them individually and not in the presence of other witnesses. And it looks to me like in Mark, you just had guys going up there and giving testimony, and Mark even says none of them lined up. None of them did. In the Sanhedrin 4 and section 2, the testimony of two witnesses found to be in contradiction rendered both witnesses invalid. So if you got two guys claiming to be the two witnesses and their testimony didn't line up exactly and precisely, their testimony was rendered invalid. It was thrown out of court. Go with me to Matthew 26. Matthew 26. So Mark tells us you got all these witnesses coming up and they're making false testimony. None of them stick. You got guys, two of them come up and say, Jesus said he's going to tear down the temple and in 3 days he's going to rebuild it. And it won't be rebuilt with hands. He was talking about his own body, but they took his words and they twisted it to mean he's talking about the physical place of worship there. And Mark even tells us yet about their testimony. It didn't even agree. So Caiaphas is getting frustrated. Look at Matthew 26, verse 62. And the high priest stood up and said, have you no answer to make? Now remember, Jesus isn't allowed to convict himself. He's not supposed to have to testify against himself. What is it that these men testify against you? But Jesus remained silent, and the high priest said to him, I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. So Caiaphas now puts Jesus under oath because he won't say anything. And Jesus said to him, verse 64, you have said so, but I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds. Verse 65, then the high priest tore his robes and said, he has uttered blasphemy. What further witnesses do we need? You have now heard his blasphemy. What is your judgment? And they answered, he deserves death. And they spit in his face and struck him. And some slapped him, saying, prophesy to us, you Christ. Who is it that struck you? So Caiaphas puts him under oath because Jesus, up until this point, had said nothing other than to Annas, go ask the witnesses who heard me speak. And Caiaphas is getting upset because all of these false witnesses are coming forward and they're making false accusations against Jesus, and Jesus is just sitting there silent. You see, the trial would have never gotten off the ground had Jesus just stayed silent. He didn't have to testify against himself, and really, technically, they weren't allowed to convict him by his own words, by something he said. However, Jesus knew what the will of the Father was. Jesus has already told his disciples and the group that arrested him, the hour of darkness is here. It is now. And so when he's placed under oath, he does indeed declare, I am the long-awaited Messiah. I am the Son of God. I am the anointed King. And when Jesus says, yeah, what you say, Caiaphas, is right, Caiaphas puts on this religious show and he tears his high priestly garments, which he wasn't supposed to do in the first place, and he declares Jesus to be blaspheming. The reason that's so important is because in Leviticus 24, verse 16, the Levitical law says anyone who blasphemes the name of the Lord is to be put to death. and the entire assembly must stone them, whether foreign or native born. When they blaspheme the name, they are to be put to death. And so when Jesus says, yes, I am the Son of God, they say, no, you're not. That's blasphemy, and we're going to kill you. And the entire council begins to scream, he deserves to die. And they're punching Jesus in the face and slapping Jesus in the face and spitting in his face. This is where Luke picks up. Right here, right at this moment. Go with me now to Luke chapter 22. Luke 22 and verse 63. Luke 22, verse 63. Now the men who were holding Jesus in custody were mocking him as they beat him. See, this is what is happening right there at the end of Matthew 26, verse 68. And they also blindfolded him and kept asking him, prophesy, who struck you? And they said many other things against him, blaspheming him. Now jump down to verse 66. When day came, that's important, underline that, circle that. When day came, the assembly of the elders of the people gathered together both chief priests and scribes, and they led him away to their council. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the first two trials, the trial with Annas and the first trial with Caiaphas, is completely and totally illegal. And any blockhead walking down the street in Jerusalem would have known that, because these trials took place in the middle of the night, and they did not take place at the judgment hall. They took place at the home of the high priest. And so now, to make these trials at least appear legitimate, they are going to take Jesus away. They led him away to their council. They're leading him away to the judgment hall at daybreak. At daybreak, the NIV says at daybreak, the ESV says when day came. You were not allowed to put somebody on trial during the night hours before the morning sacrifice. So now, in an attempt to make this trial look like it's on the up and up, even though they've already declared Jesus to be guilty, they're going to lead him away during the daylight hours to their judgment hall and put him on trial for their official trial. And they said to him, verse 67, if you are the Christ, tell us. But he said to them, if I tell you, you will not believe. And if I ask you, you will not answer. Now, when I read that verse, if I tell you, you will not believe, and if I ask you, you will not answer, it took me back to when Jesus first entered Jerusalem and he's teaching in the temple, remember? And all of these religious leaders kind of blitz Jesus, and they ask him, by what authority are you doing these things? Remember, he had cleansed the temple, and he upset all of these religious elites. And they rush in there, by whose authority are you doing these things? By whose authority are you challenging the family of Annas who controls this temple? And Jesus says, I got a question for you. And if you answer my question, I'll answer your question. And he says, the baptism of John, was it by man or from God? And remember, they do their holy huddle, and they huddle up, and they say, if we say from men, the people are going to kill us, because they perceive John to be a prophet of God. But if we say from God, Jesus is going to say, well, then why didn't you submit to him? Why didn't you obey him? Why didn't you follow him? And so they turned to Jesus and they said, we don't know. We don't know where John's baptism came from. If it was from men or from God, we don't know. And I wonder if that same group of men is this same group of men right here. And Jesus is saying, if I tell you, you won't believe me. And if I ask you, you have no answer for me. Guys, we've already danced this dance before. We've already been here. And it gets us nowhere. Verse 69, Luke 22. But from now on, here Jesus goes. But from now on, the Son of Man shall be seated at the right hand of the power of God. And so they all said, Are you the Son of God then? And he said to them, You say I am. Are you the Son of God then? Jesus says, You say that I am. Jesus is saying, I agree with you in that statement. I am the Son of God, but I don't agree with what you're trying to do with that statement. You're going to say that statement is blasphemy. But I am the Son of God. Verse 71. Then they said, What further testimony do we need? We have heard it ourselves from his own lips. And they officially declared Jesus to be guilty of blasphemy, deserving of death. There's still some legal problems with that. In the Mishnah, book of Sanhedrin, chapter 4, and 1 says, the members of the Sanhedrin were to meet in pairs all night long. So even if they thought Jesus was guilty, this group of 70 guys was supposed to take the entire night and be meeting in pairs all night long, discussing and weighing out the evidence. That's why they couldn't. That's why you weren't supposed to put trials on festivals, because festivals took place in the evening. You can't be meeting in pairs all night and participate in a festival. But by law, they were supposed to meet in pairs all night long and discuss the case and reconvene for the purpose of confirming the final verdict. You see, they weren't even supposed to pass a final verdict until the next day after they had met in pairs all night long and imposing sentence. Sentencing in a capital case could not occur until the following day. It was completely illegal to put the guy on trial and then, in a capital case, pass down a verdict that same day. Sanhedrin 4 and 2 says, voting for conviction. See, when the Sanhedrin met, you had to vote. You couldn't just all as a group say, he's guilty. You had to pass an individual vote. Voting for a conviction and sentencing in a capital case was to be conducted individually, beginning with the youngest. The youngest men in the Sanhedrin would vote first so that they wouldn't be influenced by the older members. Over and over and over and over, we see injustice being done. And the more you look at this and the more you study this, doesn't it make your blood boil? Doesn't it make you angry when you see injustice, especially injustice done against Jesus, because he was completely and totally innocent of all wrongdoing and all sin? But yet when we see justice, even in modern day, when we see justice, it makes our blood boil. Because why? Because you and I are created in the image of God. And justice is something that's important to God, and therefore it has been woven into our being that we desire and long for justice. And when we see injustice being done, or when we experience injustice being done to us, it bothers us. It disturbs us. Especially when we experience injustice alone, or when injustice goes unnoticed or ignored. There's something inside the human heart that says that is not right. Something inside us, it just bothers us. It eats at us. God made us that way. But listen to what Chuck Swindoll says about justice and injustice. He says, because we are polluted with sin, our desire for justice becomes a supremely selfish pursuit most of the time. Outrage demands satisfaction. Bitterness demands revenge. A self-centered hopelessness begs heaven for relief. Desperate isolation longs for an advocate, while an uncaring world watches idly at our suffering. In that lonely crucible of unfairness, the silence of heaven can be deafening. Injustice should bother us. But a lot of times when we're the ones experiencing injustice, we don't care how we get justice. We just want justice served, and we want it served now. And a lot of us have experienced that sharp knife of injustice. A lot of us have experienced slander that maybe it ruined your reputation. Gossip that has divided you from close relationships and people you care about. Maybe false accusations has changed the course of your life. Maybe persecutions have fallen on you instead of the people you know are actually guilty of whatever it is you're accused of. And when we suffer this injustice, it makes it all the harder to pray the prayer that Jesus told us to pray in the Lord's Prayer, where he said, pray that God would forgive you as you have forgiven your debtors. It's hard to pray that because it's hard to forgive our debtors. It's hard to forgive the people that have treated us with injustice. Church, I want you to know justice will be served. Justice will be served. In Psalms 94 that was read for us in the reading this morning, verse 14 says, for the Lord will not forsake his people. He will not abandon his heritage. Surely judgment will again be righteous. There is a day that righteous judgment will be handed down. However, it probably won't come as quickly as you and I would like it to. In John chapter 16, verse 33, Jesus said to his disciples, after he's told them they're going to suffer a lot, he says, I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world, church, listen, in this world you and I will have trouble. But take heart, I have overcome the world. Jesus never promised to keep us from injustice, but he has promised to preserve us through the injustice that we experience here. And so I want you to know, when you experience this injustice, as bad as you want to lash out and as bad as you want revenge, I want you to know God can use the bad for good. Nothing you experience is going to go to waste. Think about what God did with Jesus' injustice, the injustice that was poured out on Jesus in these trials. It was through that injustice that God brought about our perfect salvation. Think what he can do with whatever it is you're suffering through. And I bet Peter was looking back on this night and on these trials that his Lord and his Master went through when he wrote what he wrote in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 20. He writes, but how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing what is wrong? Peter says, you get no credit if you do something wrong and you get a beating for it. But if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God. We're going to suffer injustice. That's a part of life. But one day, truth is going to reign supreme. The Sanhedrin did not care about justice. All they wanted was Jesus dead. He was bad for business. They wanted him out of his way. And by judging Jesus wrongly, they condemn themselves to hell for all of eternity. By judging Jesus wrongly, they condemn themselves to hell, as does everyone out in the world who judges Jesus wrongly. They condemn themselves the same way the Sanhedrin did. So as you're sitting in here this morning, what is your verdict? What is your judgment of the Jesus that claimed to be Christ? Do you believe he is the Son of God, as he claimed to be? Do you believe he lived a perfect and sinless life? Because he did. Do you believe that he died in your place? He took your sins upon himself. And as he hung on that cross, all of God's hatred and all of God's wrath towards your sin and my sin was poured out on his only begotten Son. Do you believe that? Do you believe that because he had no sin of his own, he was able to defeat sin, defeat Satan, and he defeated death and burst out of that tomb alive and well? Do you believe that he's coming back to claim his own and judge the world? Do you believe that he is the only way to get to the Father, to get into heaven? And no one comes to the Father except through him. That's his own words, not mine. Are you willing to give up everything and follow him? The world hated him. He said, the world's going to hate you. But don't be surprised, because it hated me first. And they will not treat a servant greater than their master. What's your verdict? What's your judgment on Jesus? If you believe all these things, if you believe Jesus is the Son of God, that he lived the perfect life you and I can't live, he died the death you and I deserve to die, and he not only died the death, but he defeated death. Sorry, choked on my words. He defeated death, he defeated Satan, he defeated sin, and he is ruling and reigning on high, and he is coming back one of these days. We don't know when, but he says, have your loins girded and your lamps lit, and you be ready, because I'm coming back. I've gone to prepare a place for you, and if I've gone, I'll come back, and I'll take you to be with me. If you believe all that, then would you not decide today to publicly proclaim, publicly announce Jesus to be your personal Lord, Master, King, Messiah, and God? Would you do that today? And maybe you've been suffering through some sort of injustice, and you're just to the point where you feel like you can't carry it anymore. The longing for revenge is eating you alive from the inside out. And you want the elders to pray over you. You want your church family to pray over you. We'd love to do that. If we can help you in any way, would you please come as we stand and sing?